Hello and welcome to this video on output gaps. In this video, we're going to look at the difference between actual growth rates and long-term trends in growth rates, understand positive and negative output gaps, and be able to illustrate output gaps using an ADAS diagram. So before we get cracking, let's have a look at some key terms we'll need for this topic. So the first one is actual growth. And we would define actual growth as being increases in real GDP. The second one is potential growth, and we would define that as increases in the capacity of the economy. The third one is trend growth, and we would say that's the long-term sustainable rate of GDP increase. The fourth one is a boom, and we describe that as the phase of the trade cycle when real GDP rises quickly. And the final one is a recession, and we would describe that as being where GDP falls for at least 2 consecutive quarters. Armed with this terminology, let's start to look at the difference between potential growth, actual growth, and trend growth. So on this chart at the bottom, we've got time along the bottom, the x-axis, and we've got national output or real GDP along the y-axis. And we might illustrate potential output like this, saying this is the maximum potential output of the economy, the PPF limit, if you like, or the productive capacity of the economy. And here we can see that is generally rising over time as we can potentially produce more. Then secondly, we might look at actual growth, so actual changes in real GDP. And typically this follows the trade cycle pattern through periods of boom and recession. But here we're never quite producing as much as we potentially could. And then lastly, what is meant by trend growth? And we would describe the trend output as the long-term sustainable average. So it's taking an average of the actual output and then doing a kind of line of best fit to say, what would we expect the level of output to be at any particular time? What's the trend? Now, an important concept for us to understand is that of an output gap. And an output gap is where there is a difference between the actual output and either the trend or potential output. So if you have a look at the UK economy, we can see that between 2002 and 2008, real GDP is indicated by the red line. And if we do a trend, what was the trend for this period of time, then we get the black line, a line of best fit. Now what we can see is that after 2008, a gap opens up in terms of output between the actual output in the red line and the trend level of output, which is the black line. And we would describe that as being an output gap, where there's a difference between the actual output and what we would expect from the economy. Now output gaps can come as either positive gaps or negative gaps. A positive output gap indicates that the economy is growing faster than trend. So it's operating at overcapacity and it's likely that prices will go up as a result and inflation is likely to occur. Whereas a negative output gap indicates that the economy is growing slower than trend. This indicates to us there is spare capacity in the economy and perhaps unemployment might result. So if you look at our trade cycle diagram again, with real GDP indicated by the red line and the long-term trend indicated by the dotted line, where we have periods where real GDP is higher than trend, we would say that there is a positive output gap, possibly towards the boom stage of the trade cycle. Where real GDP is lower than the trend, we're at under capacity, there is spare capacity and we're growing slower than trend, we would say a negative output gap exists within the economy. So let's take these definitions down, take this diagram down, and then move on to a second way of illustrating the concept of an output gap. And that is by using a PPF diagram. So we can also illustrate an output gap using a PPF diagram. So here we have our production possibility frontier, the maximum combination of goods and services that could be produced in an economy. And if our economy is actually producing at point A, that combination of consumer goods and capital goods, we would say there is an output gap. The actual output is less than the potential output. The final way of illustrating an output gap is to use an ADAS diagram. And here we're going to indicate output gaps using the classical long-run aggregate supply curve. So what we can see here is that when output is at Y1, when the economy is here, with this level of aggregate demand, a low level of aggregate demand here has caused a negative output gap because less is being produced than the full employment level of output, what potentially could be produced in the long run. When we have high level of aggregate demand within the economy, AD2, and the level of output of Y2, we have a positive output gap because more is being produced than can sustainably be produced in the long run. So the classical view is that output gaps can exist, but they should only be in the short term. In the long term, prices adjust and full employment would be restored. We can also illustrate output gaps using the Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve. So here we can see a negative output gap where Y1 level of output is less than Y2, which is the long-run maximum level of output. Now a slight difference here in the Keynesian view is that the negative output gap can persist in the long term because this position here and this position here are both on the long-run aggregate supply curve. So in the long term, you can get persistent negative output gaps. However, positive output gaps won't exist in the long term and will only lead to inflationary pressure. So they do agree with that point of view. Okay, what might be difficulties measuring the output gap? How do we know how big it is and whether we're that confident about it? Well, firstly, how accurate is the long-term trend? How far back in time would we go to establish this trend? And secondly, how easy is it to estimate the potential growth or the productive capacity of the economy? How do we know exactly how much GDP could be being produced if the economy was at full employment? So in this video, we've looked at the difference between actual growth and long-term trends in growth. We've looked at positive and negative output gaps, and we should be able to illustrate these using the trade cycle diagram, PPF diagram, or ADS diagram. And so that ticks off our last objective. Thanks for listening. Thanks very much.